Welcome to the 2018 Feminist Writers Festival. I'm Christy, and I want to acknowledge that our festival held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and the elders from other communities who may be present today. Welcome tonight to Legacy Books, our first event of the 2018 festival. The Feminist Writers Festival was established in 2016 to support and to promote feminist writers in Australia. And this year we're rewriting the story. We're promoting feminist writers in Australia who are using words to make change, who are creating powerful personal and political narratives, and who are choosing stories over silence. We're talking about the way feminist writers are tackling topics of violence against women, activism and advocacy, and how women actively mentor one another. How can we sustain feminist voices and come together to break the silence? We hope your festival experience includes networking, skilling up, inclusivity, creating community, as we all keep working together to create structural change. We'd love to hear from everyone on social media throughout the festival and beyond, but for now, please do turn your phones onto silent as we're recording and live streaming tonight's event and the rest of the events throughout the festival. But do join in the conversation by using the hashtag FWF18. I want to give a huge thanks to the authors participating throughout the festival, to the incredible team of volunteers working behind the scenes and those who are coming together this weekend to make the event possible. We'd like to acknowledge the financial support of the Victorian Government and that this session is sponsored by the Saturday Paper, and Anne-Marie Priest's participation is made possible by her publisher, UWA Press. We also want to thank our venue partner, Loop, who's been generous and fabulous to work with. And, of course, you. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for coming tonight and for supporting us. For now, I'm going to introduce you to our MC for this evening, Foong Kong, who's a member of the Feminist Writers Festival board. She has 2 decades of experience in the publishing industry as an editor and a publisher of books across a wide range of genres, from children's books to fiction, non-fiction and illustrated titles. She's worked freelance and in-house for a number of publishers, was managing editor of the Anne Summers Reports, and is presently working at the Parliament of Victoria as editor of Debates. Ling, thank you.
Okay, well, that was the first hurdle, basically, to get up here without tripping.
And this is the person who...
I look forward to the platform on my way down. Thank you for being here tonight. A panel on legacy books may seem a slightly strange way to open a festival, but given this year's theme of rewriting the story, we thought it made sense to have a look at the story so far, the better for us to look forward and be informed on how stories may be rewritten. As has been said, we must understand our own history if we are to write our own futures. It was 130 years ago, almost to the day, that Louisa Lawson, writing under the pseudonym Dora Falconer, produced the first edition of the feminist magazine Dawn. In her first editorial, she said, excuse me, is there anything I need to do to stop that? Just closer? Okay. In her first editorial, Louisa Lawson said, "Every eccentricity of belief and every variety of bias in mankind allies itself with a printing machine. But where is the printing ink champion of mankind's better half? There has hitherto been no trumpet through which the concentrated voice of womankind could publish their grievances and their opinions." And from those early days of Dawn, where many women got their start writing, reviewing and debating, have come books that captured and concerned themselves with women's oppression, books that were interested in and engaged in changing women's social, economic, cultural and political lives, and books that changed lives. So tonight our speakers will tell us about the books that made them, the things that made, and things made from letters that they're writing to fill the gaps. The books that have started conversations, debates, even fights. The books that have endured, and perhaps why. Perhaps it can be said that every book is more or less a legacy book. A book need only have amused, cajoled, infuriated, enraged, engaged, or started a dialogue, and it can be said to have done its work, to have left its mark. So tonight we'll run it something like this. We'll introduce each speaker who will speak for between 5 and 8 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next speaker and save your questions for the end, and we'll work through them then. Okay, our first speaker tonight is Alison Croggon. Alison is an award-winning novelist, poet, and librettist. She's a critic for outlets such as The Australian, The ABC, and The Monthly, and has published 8 collections of poetry and several novels, including the acclaimed Pellinor Fantasy Quintet. Her latest book is Fleshes. Please make Alison welcome.
Hello. Is this working? Yeah. I'm audible? Excellent. I actually didn't write anything down tonight, so this is going to be interesting. I'm very paranoid and I always write everything down. But I thought 5 minutes, it'll be fine, so we'll see how I go. I wanted to talk about 2 very different books tonight, one of which was very important to me as a writer and as someone who thinks in language, and one of which basically saved my life. When I was a young woman, I was one of those young women who said I was not a feminist. I was raised in the country. This is in the 70s. I moved to Melbourne and I worked as a journalist, which was then in 1980, which is when I got a cadetship on the Melbourne Herald, a totally male-dominated profession. And I was one of the first intakes of cadets that basically, I think I was the first cadet to ever be put on industrial relations as a round, and my colleague was the first on police rounds. So when women had gone into journalism before, they were put into what was considered soft stuff like features and the women's section, which I'm sure some of you remember. So, and I became a journalist because my father said I had to get a job and that being a poet wasn't a job. So I thought, okay, journalism's about writing. And I became a journalist, and that was my early 20s. And so then I decided I was very unhappy, and I left and because I wanted to write poetry. And that was around 1985. And I was a pretty fucked up young woman. I was, in a fairly kind of ordinary way. It was... my parents divorced when I was a kid. There was a lot of, conflict, and the things that I was kind of brought up with, I internalised, as you do. I'd internalised a whole lot of things, but I also hated them. So it took me a long time. All I'm saying is it took me longer than it should have to get to feminism. And what happened was I had a baby. So I had my first baby at 25, and I kind of had him by accident because I wouldn't have had a baby on purpose, because the whole idea of having babies and marriage was never anything I ever wanted to do. Like it was the thought filled me with horror. And yet I decided to have this child. And so, being me, I naturally didn't think about having a baby. When I was pregnant, I read everything I could get my hands on about pregnancy and decided what kind of birth I wanted and, what I didn't want. I was terrified of medical intervention and that kind of thing. And I was fortunate in that I had no complications, and I had my first baby in the birthing centre, and that was all very good. So basically, aside from the fact that my partner was then, pretty fucked really, and he wanted to marry me, which I didn't want, and he was Greek, and very. If you know anything about a lot of Greek men and how Greek machismo works, you might understand that. But anyway, so it was all a bit of a mess, not ideal. And, but, you know, I was really well informed about pregnancy. Until I actually had the baby, I had no idea that there would be a baby at the end of it. Really. And then I had a baby and I didn't know what to do with it. And so what happened was, looking back, pretty much a version of postpartum depression, probably fairly mild, but I was pretty kind of crazy. And Josh had colic, which is such a kind of simple word. It sounds not very much at all. It's not life-threatening. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't actually harm the baby as such, but it's basically terrible indigestion. Nobody knows why it happened. And he had it for 3 months. And what it means is that you have a baby that cries all the time. And that then feeds into a kind of feedback loop where the mother's exhausted, the baby's tense, the baby doesn't digest, there's more crying. So that was my life for 3 months, which actually I have very little memory of. It was very dark. But we got through that, and it was a very formative part of my life. Because the other thing that happened was, it was fine when I was pregnant. This is strange, but as soon as I had a baby, I was a mother. And that was the first time in my life I'd kind of managed to, as a young woman who's working in a profession and kind of, you know, doing the thing, I'd kind of avoided the whole thing of a role. I'd kind of managed to slip through those things. As soon as I was a mother, it was the first time I hit bang, the whole thing of a gender role. And it was a real smack in the face, quite apart from being exhausted and all the things that happen when you have a new baby and you don't have a clue what you're doing with it. Was I was really afraid I'd fucked up my life. And I was, you know, I wanted to be a poet. That's what I wanted to do at that time. So I was literally told to my face by a man that my having a baby was the end of a promising young poet. I obviously have never forgotten that. It's the sort of thing you never forget. So while all this was going on, I lost a stone and a half. That's a lot of weight. I don't know what it is in kilos. And I would look at pictures of me then. I was just like, so skinny. And so I was not doing so well, but I was writing poems in my head. I didn't have time to write things down, but when I was in bed, I'd think up poems in my head and I'd remember them and I'd write them down when I could. You can do that with poems because they're short, but I'd write them in my head. Is that okay? Oh, okay. So, anyway, so what happened was a friend of mine gave me Alice Walker's book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And that was the book that saved my life. And it was the first feminist text I ever read. It's a series of essays about basically Alice Walker talking about writing, motherhood, and she's talking in particular about her ancestors and how under slavery they were not allowed to learn how to read or write, and how women, even so, carried the flame of creativity through these generations and passed them on to their daughters. And it was where I read that she said, I don't write in spite of motherhood, I write because of motherhood. And that struck me so deeply. And there were so many other things. I mean, it's a deeply generous book. And I brought in a quote, which I'd like to read to you. For you will find, as women have found through the ages, that changing the world requires a lot of free time, requires a lot of mobility, requires money, and as Virginia Woolf put it so well, a room of one's own, preferably with a key and a lock. Which means that women must be prepared to think for themselves, which means undoubtedly trouble with boyfriends, lovers and husbands, which means all kinds of heartache and misery, and times when you will wonder if independence, freedom of thought, or your own work is worth it at all. We must believe that it is. for the world is not good enough and we must make it better. So I had all those heartache, trouble, misery with boyfriends and finally, only ever ended up staying with a man who was a writer because I could not stay with anybody who did not respect my work, and most men seem to consider it a hobby. The other writer who was very important to me was Dale Spender, an Australian feminist, and her 1980 book, Man-Made Language. I hope that's the title. Which talked about basically how language is constructed, and it still is, less so now because women have changed that, a whole lot of things, as it reflects a reality in which the male is the default, and this goes down all the way down to the actual nuts and bolts of the grammar, that there is a binary system, there are only two genders, that the man, remember, you still read books where he is universal. I used to resent that enormously when it began to dawn on me as a writer that I could not stand for universal humankind because I was not a man, because only men did that. So Dale Spender's book looks at all the nuts and bolts of what that actually means in terms of the construction of our grammar, and it's a very important book. And I think I've run out of time, so thank you very much, Foong.
Thank you for that, Alison. Our next speaker is Evelyn Araluen. Evelyn is a writer, researcher and teacher working with Indigenous literatures and representation at the University of Sydney, and the coordinator of Black Rhymes Aboriginal Poetry Night in Redfern. In 2017, she was the winner of the Nakata Brophy Young Indigenous Writers Prize, and in 2018, she was the winner of the Judith Wright Poetry Prize. Born and raised in Darug country and community, she's a descendant of the Bunjalong Nation. Please welcome Evelyn.
All right, Jingi Walla everyone. I assume you can hear me because I can hear myself, which normally means that everyone else can hear me. Yeah, we're good. Just wanting to extend my respect and my acknowledgements of the Woiwurrung Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, upon whose country we meet today. I also would like to extend my respect to the survivors of the Corranderk Reserve, many of whom have gathered and sought refuge on this country, and would also just like to further extend that to the Kamaragundra Reserve, from which some of my family have come and some of my family who have sought that refuge in Naarm. So I'm very delighted to be with you all today. I find the way in which my work and my identity is often situated in proximity to discourses of feminism very interesting. I think I can see quite a lot of young women in the audience and young femmes in the audience who I believe would have approached feminism in a similar way that I did in terms of its distribution and the actual access that we have, sort of millennials. We found feminism as a kind of understanding logic and a language of resistance through social media, through the internet. It was not necessarily that our experiences were shaped by that language, but that we were very lucky that many of us actually had access to the work that many older generations had been struggling to put together for several years. And I found a lot of that on Tumblr. So yeah, I was just like, oh, I want to reblog this nice picture of an eyeshadow palette. And also, have you heard of intersectionality? And I'm better than you. So I fell into feminism, or rather sort of began to approach and associate myself with the language of feminism through my exposure in a very different textual realm than what even people 5 years older than me would have had access to. And that has radically shifted the way in which people who were, who sort of were born into a time in which as teenagers, when we were old enough to actually kind of vaguely grasp things, we were able to access information on that in a much more accessible form than many women who came before us. And so I always do like to just sort of show as much respect as I can to the women and to the femmes who did this work at a time in which it was not as anywhere near as accessible and the tools were not anywhere near as accessible. But having said that, the way in which I came to a language of feminism and, the discourse and the tools of feminism was heavily inflected by my position as an Aboriginal woman. So what we encountered on Tumblr, was very often a sort of generalised, more often than not US-centric language of feminism, which was more concerned with identity politics, which was more concerned with the policing of social media language than it was necessarily occupied with actual material struggle. And so it's kind of a bit of an issue when people just sort of take their feminism exclusively from Tumblr and end up in these sort of, that's no shame, no hate on Tumblr, but you gotta grow up at some particular point in time. So I felt very empowered to the point of being a bit bratty that I was able to access all of this language, and then it was something like, in identity politics, intersectionalism, my experience does differ from that, and now I have all of these oppression points that I can gain over other people on the internet, and I can become more powerful than them, and I will be the strongest social justice warrior. No, I kid you not, this was kind of what I was going through at like 19, so I'm really glad that I stopped using Tumblr. Please, no one look up my account. Just don't do that to yourselves. But I don't necessarily want my discussion here about legacy books to be privileging academic distribution and framing of feminism and discourses of feminism. But what I do want to be emphasising is the way in which different theoretical tools and different tools of social class, race analysis have created space and dialogue for people who are actually very often excluded from those watered down and generalised and sort of vaguely distributed ideas about feminism. So when I started to understand that contemporary feminism was actually not necessarily very concerned with with the specifics of my experience, and that there were just certain points in time in which feminism would be emphasising concerns and values that harmed my Aboriginal brothers, so harmed the men who were, experiencing state violence, and harmed the men who were in a compromised position towards the state and whose sovereignty was compromised by the dispossessing powers which were empowering many white feminists. I did actually have to come to the point in which I realised that this watered down, US-centric and predominantly quite white-focused feminism that I'd had access to on Tumblr just wasn't going to cut it. So I never actually decided to be like an academic feminist. I never decided to be an academic. I will just point out that the Australian Postgraduate Award pays double the dole, and that's where I ended up at 21. I have no idea how I have become a PhD candidate. Somebody please tell me what I do with this thesis. But I have sort of gradually, I think partially just because of my identity and partially just because of my interest in decolonisation, which necessarily has to attend to the influence of colonisation on our gender paradigms and on our languages and representations of gender. I've kind of fallen into this space in which I actually do need to be ethically, constructively, and quite, well informed about what feminism is and the limitations of different forms of feminism for Aboriginal people. And these limitations are extended also to intersectional modes of feminism. I very often was sort of told, oh, it's okay that you don't find your experience in white feminism because now we have intersectional feminism for you here. And it was like, well, okay, number one, Kimberly Crenshaw is amazing, but she actually had no intention of intersectionality being used as a kind of like, here is like, oh, you can have this brand of feminism, or you can have this brand of feminism. You have to buy them all at the same counter, and the counter is capitalism, but you can choose your different colours and styles and things. The issue that I had with that is that the depiction of the various aspects of your identity and the axes of your either oppression or your privilege as kind of, different branches of the tree of the individual was not actually creating a space for sovereignty as a soil. There was no understanding that indigeneity is not just one part of my identity politics. It's not something on a list. It is actually the fundamental, foundational blood. It is the blood memory of my entire being, and everything must come from that. It cannot be depicted as an equal value or on the same kind of level as my gender, apart from anything else, as some of the writers who I will very briefly talk about have identified. Colonisation has impacted the languages that we have of our gender. And so I do need feminism to address that. But feminism is not going to give me my sovereignty as an Aboriginal woman. So the best text for me to kind of understand the confusing place that I found myself in, where of course I was angered about the different ways in which gender configured me for specific roles and for specific positionalities. But to understand that that is actually very often a part of a race and class structure that was not being addressed by those languages. The really important text for me was Auntie Eileen Morton Robinson's Talking Up to the White Woman, Indigenous Women and Feminism. Auntie Eileen is a Quandamooka academic feminist writer. She's incredibly intimidating to read as a young Aboriginal woman who's just sort of entering tentatively into academia and then suddenly witnesses just the profound strength and integrity of her writing. But it was a phenomenal book for me to read for a number of different values which I could take from it, but also a number of different languages of analysis, of critique. And yes, it is something which is primarily concerned with middle-class white women co-opting different languages of feminism, of supposedly liberatory languages, but also quite significantly, it talks about the way in which white middle-class women have always positioned themselves as central in these particular discourses. And Indigenous women have been silenced and erased from not only the liberatory discourses, but also from all of the available archives which we actually have to try to reclaim something of our experience. So another writer who's been of enormous influence to me is Noongar poet and academic Natalie Harkin, who wrote an essay that was, I can't remember the full title of the essay, Remapping the Archive, Blood in the Memory, something like that. And it was about the actual presence of her grandmother in the South Australian State Archives of Aboriginal people. And in this essay, she talks really beautifully and very violently, and with this very violent bodily imagery of haunting the archive as the archive haunts her. And what that essay gave to me was an understanding that I don't actually need to be seeking my languages of feminism, and I don't need to be seeking my languages of liberation in the forms and the distributions of the colonial state. It is wonderful to have a book like Talking Up to the White Woman, which has been recognised as being, academically brilliant and insightful and intelligent and very, very effective. But that there are also histories and stories and, articulations of womanhood within the archive that can be accessed and can be liberated from that. So I guess my kind of conclusion from this is that feminism comes to you, and the languages of feminism comes to you in a multitude of ways, and very often the work that we do in accessing that is often the work that we do to decolonise and deconstruct and reclaim something of ourselves from that language.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Our next speaker is Alison Evans. Alison is the author of YA novel Ida, which won the Victorian Premier's People's Choice Award and has been shortlisted in the Aurelis Awards. They write about weird stuff, queers, magic, and plants. Welcome, Alison.
Hi, how's it going? I didn't know there was going to be a lectern, so I just put it all on my phone. So I'm not tweeting, I promise. I've always read a lot of children's fiction throughout my life, so I guess it makes sense that I write for kids. When I was a teenager, basically all I did was read books. I read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of it was written by men, but there were always a lot of wonderful girl characters, and from what I remember, a lot of them were the main characters, and I really just loved getting lost in their worlds. I mean, I say girl here because I didn't really know I was genderqueer for a while, and I wouldn't really learn that word until I was out of high school. Thank you, Tumblr. And I didn't get to see it in a book for a long time. When I did, it was a book written by one of my friends who is also genderqueer, so that is why it was very accessible to me. So I liked the girls who would fight dragons and save their friends. Looking back now, I had a lot of book girlfriends. I definitely had a crush on Garth Nix's Sabriel, who is a babe. I didn't read contemporary fiction a lot because I was pretty obsessed with magic and maps, and like I would draw my own maps and stuff. But one time I was hanging out with my aunt at her job, and the only thing available to read was like a class set of Looking for Alibrandi, so there were like 20 copies there, and she was like, "We have books," and I was like, I'll take one. So I took one, and yeah, so I started to read. And Josie, the main character, was perfect. She was perfect because she really wasn't. She was sometimes a brat, or mean, or irrational. She didn't know what she wanted, but she really did know what she wanted as well. She was so overwhelmed, and she was sad and mad at the world, and she wanted to be loved and had wonderful friends. And she was so, like, she wasn't anything like me, but she was exactly like me. And I just felt like I felt every single thing that she was feeling. We were just so connected. And that connection was just so warm and so nice, and just so, it was so immediate and comforting. And I think this is why I really fell in love with young adult books, YA books. They were like my friends when I didn't have any in real life. And I thought, you know, maybe I could write them too. And I could show the word genderqueer to someone who might really need to see it. YA in Australia, Australia especially, is something that is really exciting at the moment. If you have a look at the books that have been published here just in the last couple of years, they're so wonderful, and they're so just really beautiful. Night Swimming by Steph Bow is something that I think we really desperately need more of. It's a book about a girl, and she has a crush on a girl. And there's no queer trauma, like there's none. And I can't think of another text that I have read that didn't have even a little bit of it. So finding that, I was just so grateful that it actually exists. It's cute and it's fun, and it's about friendship and family. And the girls get to hold hands and kiss and hang out, and they don't have to feel guilty or wrong about it just by virtue of them not being straight. Another book about queer girls is Clancy of the Undertow by Christopher Curry. He's a man, but he absolutely captures that feeling that I know a lot of girls feel, especially when you're a teenager. I know I felt it when I thought I was a girl, even though I'm not, and I still feel it now. And it's that feeling of absolute dread and shame of being really worried that you're going to treat a girl that you think is cute like how you know men treat you. And he captures it so well, and just seeing that in a text I think was it was kind of healing in a way, because you can sort of recognize that, and then you're like, okay, it's not my fault. It's kind of the fact that every queer girl and non-binary femme people in fiction character is always, not always, but often over-sexualized or for the male gaze, and it really does internalize a lot of shame. So that was really, I feel like that, hopefully that can start, a legacy, if you will. In the Dark Spaces by Callie Black is another book that I love. It's not set in Australia, but in deep space, so a little different. And the aliens use a different gender system to Western human society. It's very bloody, it's really violent, some of it's quite disgusting. But when there are moments of warmth, they really radiate out into the whole text, and I do think of it as quite a warm and really beautiful book. And seeing the alien race who didn't use a gender binary was amazing to me, because I've only seen it a handful of times. Often it's like misc aliens who look like women because they have boobs. And then they kiss each other and it's all cool, but anyway. So through the main character's point of view, we sort of interrogate that idea of assuming there will be a binary in an alien human race, that they will somehow use a human gender system because it makes sense. And then when it's kind of about a third of the way through, and you realise that these aliens aren't men and women, they are all just the same gender, you sort of take a step back and realise, hey, maybe there isn't, that isn't all there is. I mean, some people would take a step back, but I was just kind of like, oh my God, fucking finally. And I kind of screamed a bit, but enjoy, so it's great. And the last book specifically I want to talk about is Living on Hope Street by Demet Dvorin. It's blisteringly feminist. It really looks very closely at toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. It deals with a few point of view characters whose lives are connected to the street, Hope Street, and one family whose father is quite toxic and violent, and how his son Cain sees that and he wants to act out. He wants to be violent too. He wants to kill his father. It sort of goes through and he kind of comes to that conclusion. And then he meets Ahmed, who lives a couple of houses down, a young man, and he really likes his car, and he helps the old man down the road, and he really tries to connect with Cain and Sam, Cain's little brother. And he's a man, and he's really warm, and he's really kind and caring, and he's a very different man to Sam and Cain's father. And I think the future of Australian books, of Australian YA books, lies in books like these. Teens who care about their world, people who care about each other. I'm really proud to be able to write for teens. I think they're the most wonderful people, and they are definitely the most wonderful readers, like, no offense. In all these books, the authors really clearly respect their audiences. They don't shy away from new ideas, or like ideas where adults don't want to talk about teens to them, even though these things happen to teenagers, but we have to protect them. But these authors really tackle these issues quite head on, and they just really show respect, I think. And I think it's books like these that really make that connection, like I felt with Josie Alibrandi, so immediate and so close and so warm. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Our next speaker is Anne-Marie Priest. Anne-Marie is a scholar and writer who has published Great Writers, Great Loves, The Reinvention of Love in the 20th Century, and A Free Flame, Australian Women Writers and Vocation in the 20th Century. A Free Flame received a high commendation in the 2016 Dorothy Hewitt Award, and in 2017, Anne-Marie won the Hazel Rowley Literary Fellowship. Welcome, Anne-Marie.
Thanks very much. It was really great to hear Evelyn talking about young adult fiction. I feel a bit jealous actually, because young adult fiction when I was a teenager really hadn't hit its straps. And yeah, so when I was a kid, well, actually there's probably another factor here as well. My family were very fundamentalist Christians. So my mum in particular was very protective about what I read. Worried that I might find out about sex or something like that. So there was probably two things there. There was some good YA around, but I was allowed to read that. So what I tended to read was 19th century fiction, because obviously no sex. So, and that was good because Jane Eyre, it's Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, is just like a fantastic book for a proto-feminist. I'm not actually, that's not one of my books that I've chosen, but I loved that book and I read it multiple times. When I first read it, the language, the 19th century world didn't really mean anything to me, but this vivid, alive, central consciousness, this is seeing that a young girl is this complex, desiring subject. That was what was feminist about that book for me. And it just grabbed me and pulled me straight in and yeah, I loved it. So looking for other books that had that kind of strong female character, it was really, really difficult. And so, I mean, I read more 19th century fiction, Little Women, Anne of Green Gables, which are not feminist in any way except that one way, that they had a strong desiring subject. And I identify with that and I just ignored all the rest, basically. But when I got into my teens, to my shame and embarrassment, I started reading romance novels. I wish that I had sort of found fantasy and science fiction then, but I didn't find it accessible then. And I think because most of the heroes were boys, and I just really wasn't interested in reading about boys. So, and now of course I can see there's so much more now in fantasy. But there wasn't much there for me, so I'm reading romance novels, and I don't know why, but my mum didn't object to Sweet Dreams, which now I'd be like, no child should ever be able to read those. But no sex. So I discovered all about love, which I was very curious about. And I actually think now, looking back, it just occurred to me recently that the reason I was into romance is because those books were about women. I mean, well, about girls, and that's what I wanted to read about. But they weren't serious, so I read Jane Austen, and then I read Georgette Heyer, which is like Jane Austen on speed or something. It's more pleasure all the time. So yeah, this is my shameful past. And so the book that I really want to talk about today is the antidote to romance, and that is Christina Stead's For Love Alone. I don't know if you can see it. I've brought in my lovely 1979 copy with Russell Drysdale and all my notes on the side, because I love it so much. But Christina Stead is not somebody you're going to find on Tumblr, whatever that is. Yeah, I
think she's snuck on.
Well, she probably has, right? Yeah, there'd be a quote, right? There should be more than one. I don't know, for legacy, I mean, Christina Stead in some ways has an obvious legacy. She's an Australian writer who's kind of known and famous, but I sometimes think, she's obviously not read that much, even though she's known. And she's complex and a difficult writer, but this book, For Love Alone, I thought it's big. I thought it was going to be a romance novel. For Love Alone. It's really not. And if somebody's laughing who's obviously read the book. Yeah, you start off and I wanted to say there are three things about this book that challenged me completely and overturned my whole idea about love and romance. The first is the idea of female desire. Teresa Hawkins, who's the central character, as a young woman at 14, is just so horny. This book was published in 1945, And it's actually about her own, it's very loosely, very closely autobiographical. It's about her own young womanhood in the 20s. And there's this wonderful quote, which I won't read, I'll just paraphrase, where she says, at 14, I was sick with love. And at 15, I walked down the street and people could see my cheeks were red with my passion. And at 16, boys were looking at me, everyone was looking at me because they could see my passion just falling out of me. And at 17, I started to wilt because I had no love. And of course, love. These passages are quite extraordinary in the novel. It's especially written in 1945. But she just said, "What am I going to do with this huge passion? I need to have sex." And this is a child. I mean, a 14-year-old. And what was so radical for me in Sweet Dreams, there's no desire except with a specific person. So you fall in love with someone, and then you feel some chaste desire for them, which of course you don't consummate until you're married. But the idea that sexual desire can be separated from morality and ethics and from love and romance and from all of it, the idea that all of that is cultural and that we could make of sexual desire something quite different, and especially for a woman. And it's so shocking to have a 14-year-old girl say, I'm so horny. It's just like, okay. And she's really aware of that too. She says, it's shameful. Women can't speak their love, is how she puts it. And she has no one specific in mind, but those two things together, the desire and the lack of any place for this in her culture, the shame around it, it was so revelatory for me. Just think that you can have like free-floating desire. Again, probably partly this goes back to my religious context, but so the second thing that really strikes me about this novel is what she shows about love is how much it's constructed by our culture in ways that are misogynistic, women-hating. And she's constantly, the character Teresa is constantly realising that, as she says, she can't tell the man that she loves him, because that's not appropriate. She certainly can't ask for sex, and she certainly can't have sex except within marriage. And she realises that all of that is completely cultural. It's nothing that comes from her. And yet the discourse of it, about true love, it seems like a completely personal discourse. It seems like it's actually about how you feel. Christina said is brilliant at showing how the external things like culture and society become internalised and actually shape you right in to shape your thoughts and feelings and desires. There's a really awful passage again in this book, where for most of this book she's in love with a guy called Jonathan Crowe, she absolutely adores him, and she thinks she's got an imaginary idea of him, of course, and she worships him, and he's really, really horrible, and he hates her and he hates women, but he's all the time thinking she might come across. So he keeps her on a string kind of thing. And right at the end, when she realises that he's not for her, she says that she released him from her will, which I think is such a terrific way to describe what it's like to fall in love, how much self-will there is in that, how much there is of fixing your intention on somebody and making them fit. And finally, so she lets him go, and then she finds out something horrible about him, that he's asked all these women, as an experiment, he's asked 5 women to come and live with him, just to see what they would say, and nearly all of them said they would. And then he's just like, they've just had dinner, and they're outside the restaurant, and there's a row of rubbish bins there, full of rotting food, as Stead tells us. And he says, they're like that, like those bins. And she's like, those bins? There are 5 of them? And then he just starts saying how, what his experiment showed is women's degrading avidity, meaning their eagerness for love and sex. And as he's explaining all this, pontificating, she feels that all the garbage is coming out of the garbage bins and covering her, and she's disgusting and smelly and awful. And that is it's such a brilliantly depicted way of showing that underlying misogyny, and how that is so closely tied with that idea of love and marriage, that a woman has nothing but that, and so she has to be avid, because her only way of living in the world and of being happy is getting someone to marry her. Hopefully things have changed a lot since then, but that idea is still, you can still see that everywhere in our culture. The last thing about this book that I wanted to just talk about that was amazing is about marriage. All the way through, you think she's doing this for love alone, although she does also say, and I love this about her, that she has a grand destiny. Not sure what it is, but it's not just getting married. But she finally meets the perfect man, handsome, rich. He adores her. And they get together, and they don't actually get married, but close enough. He's already married, so not that perfect, but yeah. So they're together, and she's completely sexually satisfied, and then she's just like, okay, so I actually don't want to stop now. I want to try men. Again, this is 1945. And then she says, look, I thought that love, that successful love, that marriage would meet all my needs. And yet I find that I'm still thirsty, I'm still hungry, and not just for love. Sexually, she's okay now. But she's just like, my heart is questing. I want to be a wanderer through the world. And at one point, then she falls in love with another guy. And she says, and again, this is just so brilliant, she says, it wasn't that I wanted him, I wanted to be him. I wanted to be the one who's wandering. I wanted to be the one putting their foot on the deserts of the world. And again, and she doesn't leave the man that she's with, and she still loves him, and the book ends with the two of them still together and happy. But for a book to end with a marriage, well, I mean, it doesn't actually, like normally that's where the book ends, you get married. This book then has another third to go, where she meets somebody else, has an affair, and it's an intense love affair, not just a passion. Also, simultaneously continues to love the man that she's with, and he continues to love her, and then they continue together, and she's like, okay, what's my next adventure at the end of the book? 1945. This is an amazing book. So I then, how am I going for time? Okay, I then, I wanted to write about love. And it was partly as a response to this book, just opening my eyes in so many ways to the way that love stories work. So I then actually wrote a series of biographical pieces, which tried to show what love actually looks like, and the different phases of it, and how it's really not at all like a Sweet Dreams romance novel. And Christina said herself, I don't know that she would have ever called herself a feminist. She was a bit prickly, but at her time, the word feminist could mean man-hater, and she was very afraid that people might think that she was a man-hater. She really didn't want anyone to think that. She loves men, they're awesome. So even though her discourse is so brilliantly, incisively, she just pulls apart patriarchy and the influence that it has on women, she still didn't ever come up and say, I'm a feminist. And a lot of the women from the 20th century, I think, who do have things to say that would really speak to women now, and that are, I think, clearly feminist, we might miss them because they don't have that label. So I guess my proselytizing part here is, so when I came to write my next book, which is about vocation in women's lives, I focused on some 20th century women writers. And I mean, what I was looking at there was women who have a huge passion that's not a passion for love. That's something else that drives their lives. And each of those writers, I think the only one of the four, Dorothy Hewitt, would say she was a feminist. The others wouldn't use that term. But their works show that intense struggle to create themselves as desiring subjects and to sustain that through their lives. And that, to me, makes them feminist.
Can I tell them that you're doing the book on Gwen Howard? Anne-Marie's next book is actually a biography of Gwen Howard, so we can look forward to that. Lucky last, Jamila Rizvi is an author, presenter, and columnist. She previously worked as a political advisor to the Rudd and Gillard governments, you poor woman. She's the author of Not Just Lucky and most recently The Motherhood, a collection of essays about life with a newborn. She's editor-at-large for Future Woman, the Nine Network's cross-platform venture. Jamila.
Thank you.
Good evening. I have to start by apologising. I have a newly broken nose and so I'm quite nasal. So I hope I can be properly understood. I sound bizarre to myself. I was 7 years old when I realised that nobody on television looked like me. The closest was Guy from Captain Planet. Does anyone remember Guy? The planeteer with the power of water. This is the part of the story where I'm supposed to tell you about her racial identity, but I can't because I don't actually know what it was. While other characters on the show had their countries of origin named in the opening credits, or in the case of the American character, their home city, Wheeler was from New York City. The viewer only learns that Guy is from the considerably less specifically pinpointed location of Asia. In much the same way, I found the personalities of girls on television difficult to relate to. There was Angelica on Rugrats, anyone remember her? Who wanted for nothing in the self-esteem department because her mum raised her to, and this is a quote from the show, make it in a male-dominated power structure. Heaven. But everyone hated her, which made her vastly unappealing and taught me some cruel early lessons about the repercussions of women and 3-year-old girls who own their power. But beyond that, there was nothing. Nothing, nada, nobody. TV didn't satisfy, but books were different. It was in books where I found solace that there was a place in the world for someone like me. It was in books where I found characters that I wanted to be mates with and who made me feel proud of who I was. Characters who failed and found it hard to get back up again. Characters who laughed too loudly or were told that they were too much. Characters who were bossy, characters who were bitchy, characters who were bold. Characters with hair that didn't always sit quite right. I think every lover of literature has that book, the one that turned them into a reader as a child. Mine was Edith Nesbit's The Railway Children. I can still picture this amazingly, disgustingly ugly emerald green and pink floral bedspread that I was lying on when I realised, along with the protagonist, who was 12-year-old Roberta, who was just fierce, that her father was in prison and that her mother was keeping it a secret. And I remember crying myself to sleep that night. You'd be forgiving for assuming this would have put my own 7-year-old troubles in perspective, but alas, no. The very next day, my mum and I had this Barney of epic proportions about replacing the unicorn wall frieze on my bedroom. 12 months earlier, I'd insisted on its purchase, despite warnings that I'd grow out of it and would need to be satisfied for at least 2 years. I'd foolishly vowed loyalty to the abominably ugly design for life. Regret and longing didn't feature in my reading habits as a child the way they do now. Drunk on time and lack of responsibility, plus the combined generosity of my parents and a public library card, I read widely and I read regularly, far more so than I do now. Politeness didn't stop me from taking a book out to dinner or to the house of my parents' less interesting friends. I didn't have a type or even a favourite genre. I read and loved everything I could get my hands on. Perhaps the only common thread was that all my favourite books featured women and girls. I was still sounding out words in Matilda, Charlotte's Web, Little House on the Prairie, 1,000 Paper Cranes and A Little Princess. By the age of discovering The Most Wonderful Judy Blume, I was in full flight with 45 and 47 Stella Street, Hating Alison Ashley, Little Women, Looking for Ali Brandy, and Emily Rodda's Teen Power Inc. series where there was another Asian girl. It was just so exciting at the time. As I grew more conscious of the world beyond my little piece of it, I chewed through A Wrinkle in Time, Red Scarf Girl, Jane Eyre, To Kill a Mockingbird, Pride and Prejudice, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. That is what I remember of Year 6, the year when all my friends decided they hated me, but the girls in those books did not. I always preferred books with women protagonists, and it's a preference that has stuck with me as I've grown up. It's not that I don't enjoy reading books about men, right? Like I do. They're just not as interesting. Men don't have as much to talk about. It's all sport, war, and I can't really get into it. The characters don't look and sound and act exactly like me, and so I just couldn't possibly emotionally relate to those characters. I couldn't project myself onto a male character, so I refused to be interested at all. Besides, who wants to learn about the world through a lens that is not my own? The stories of women are more likely to go untold. especially to children, and where they are told, they are less financially lucrative and far less likely to be taught in schools. The stories of women of colour and other minorities even less so, except when used as pornographic insight into a life the white adult reader will never encounter. As I heard so many times at my mum's all-white book club, it's so sad, isn't it? It's just miserable. It's utterly wretched how these people lived. The silent whisper goes, thank goodness that's never going to be me. As the child of a cross-cultural marriage, I was desperate to get my hands on literature that spoke to my own experience. And then I found Amy Tan and her stories of a culture quite unlike my own and quite unlike my family's, but still she wrote stories of women who were not white. The Joy Luck Club quietly captures the tension that exists between generations, which is the result of clashing cultural expectations. Reading it was the first time I felt my own sense of living between two worlds and never being quite sure about where you belonged, articulated by someone else. And I remember that it felt like electricity, and I felt incredibly understood, and I felt seen for the first time. I've had that feeling again recently. Australia's own Maxine Beneba-Clark had me calling my mum and dad halfway through The Hate Race to read particularly striking passages down the phone. It's like us, it sounds like us, this is what it was like when we grew up, I stammered. The individual incidents are different, of course they are, but the narrative is the same. An Australia that all too often fails its people of colour. Taking me back to her childhood, Maxine transported me back to my own. To being one of only 3 children sitting outside in the hallway during scripture class. The Thai girl, the African boy, and me would spend 2 hours every Thursday morning in school time tearing the side strips off computing paper because nobody could think of anything better for us to do. We did that for 5 years before I asked Mum if I could be a Christian. There was one teacher on the staff who called us her little sweatshop. The Hate Race brought the pain back. It made it over, anew, refreshed and reborn. Yet I'm so glad about that pain because I wanted to be taken back there to the frustration of a little girl who just wanted to fit in but kept being told that she didn't look quite right, that her family wasn't quite right. The girl who heard whispers of Muslim from the other parents at drop-off and wondered why they didn't speak in normal outside voices because we weren't in the freaking library. Memory prompts pain that gives way to exquisite relief, and that's what books do for us. Books have always been where I have found my place, where screens and society told me that we were different. Books allowed me to imagine a world in the colours of my own imagination. Even reading all those tales of all the little white girls that I named earlier, I just saw them with skin that was brown because no one ever said they were white anyway. They were brown, they were black, they were creamy mocha because the authors didn't bother to say otherwise. Before I knew better, there was a black Anne of Green Gables with red hair and freckles. There was a Chinese Matilda and an Indian Jo March. They weren't real. Of course they weren't real. They existed only within the confines of my imagination. But that didn't matter because in books, it doesn't have to.